Bullied fat boy knocks on neighbor's door. What happens next is shocking. Tommy Miller's breath came in ragged gasps as he ran down Cedar Street, his backpack bouncing wildly against his spine. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the suburban landscape, but he barely noticed them through his tears. Behind him, the echoes of cruel laughter still rang in his ears. "Fat boy can't even climb the rope! Look at him dangle like a pig!" The worst part wasn't the words, he'd heard worse. It was the way Ms. Peterson, the gym teacher, had turned away pretending not to notice, just like all the other adults always did. And then there was the incident in the locker room afterward, when Jake Thompson and his gang had. Tommy choked back a sob, his feet carrying him automatically past his own house. He couldn't go home, not like this. Mom would just give him that sad, helpless look again, and Dad would launch into another lecture about standing up for yourself. As if he hadn't tried that before, as if that hadn't made everything so much worse. Without conscious decision, he found himself standing before the weathered door of number 42, the old Victorian house that had always seemed to loom over the street. Mr. Harrison lived there, the neighborhood recluse who rarely emerged except to tend his immaculate garden. Tommy had never spoken to him, but he'd often noticed the old man watching from his window, his eyes sharp and alert despite his age. Tommy's hand trembled as he raised it to knock. He didn't know why he was here, what he expected this stranger to do. But something about the way Mr. Harrison always seemed to observe everything, the way he carried himself with quiet dignity despite the whispers about him being that crazy old man. It drew Tommy like a moth to flame. The knock echoed hollowly. For a long moment, nothing happened. Tommy was about to turn away when he heard shuffling footsteps approaching from within. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, thin man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look straight through Tommy. I'm sorry to bother you," Tommy stammered, suddenly aware of how ridiculous this was. I didn't know where else." "You're the Miller boy," Mr. Harrison stated flatly. His gaze flickered past Tommy, scanning the street with an intensity that seemed odd for such a quiet afternoon. "From number 37. Tommy nodded, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "I shouldn't have come. I'll go." "Wait." Mr. Harrison's voice was quiet but commanding. He studied Tommy's face, noting the fresh bruises trying to hide beneath his collar. "You'd better come in." The interior of the house was like stepping into another era. Heavy curtains filtered the sunlight, casting everything in a sepia tone. Ancient photographs lined the walls, their subjects staring out with solemn expressions. The furniture was all dark wood and worn velvet, meticulously maintained but clearly decades old. "Sit," Mr. Harrison instructed, gesturing to a high-backed armchair. As Tommy sank into it, the old man disappeared briefly into what must have been the kitchen, returning with 2 steaming mugs. "Hot chocolate. My mother always said it was good for shock." Tommy accepted the mug gratefully, its warmth seeping into his trembling hands. Mr. Harrison settled into the chair opposite, his movements deliberate and precise. "They're calling you Pig Boy now, aren't they?" he asked suddenly, making Tommy nearly spill his drink. "Just like they called Stanley Weber Whale Boy back in '82, and Michael Chong Chunk Boy in '95. Tommy's eyes widened. "How did you?" "I've lived in this house for 63 years. Mr. Harrison cut in, his voice taking on a strange edge. "I've watched this neighborhood, this town, cycle through generations. The names change, but the patterns, they remain remarkably consistent." He leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, what was it they carved into your locker? The symbol?" Tommy felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't told anyone about that, had covered it up with his spare gym shirt before anyone could see. It was like a circle with 3 lines through it. Kind of like a crowned eye," Mr. Harrison finished, his face growing pale. "Just as I thought." He stood abruptly, moving to one of the photographs on the wall. "They're marking you. Just like they marked others before. Tell me, boy, have you noticed how the bullying seems organized? How certain kids are chosen as targets while others are left alone, regardless of their size or appearance. Tommy had never thought about it that way, but now that Mr. Harrison mentioned it. "Lucy Chin is bigger than me," he said slowly. "But no one ever says anything to her. And Jake Thompson, he's not exactly thin, but his family has lived here for generations." Mr. Harrison nodded. "Just like the Petersons, and the Whitakers, and all the others who seem to hold sway over this town." He turned back to Tommy, his expression grave. "What I'm about to tell you, what I'm about to show you, will change everything you think you know about this place. The question is, are you ready for that? Because once you know the truth, there's no going back." Tommy gripped his mug tighter, his heart pounding. The rational part of his mind said this was crazy, that he should thank the old man for the hot chocolate and leave. But something deeper, something that recognized the weight of truth in Mr. Harrison's words, made him stay rooted to the spot. "I'm ready," he said, and the words felt like signing a contract written in invisible ink. Mr. Harrison nodded once, gravely. "Then let me tell you about the real history of Millbrook Heights, and why what's happening to you is part of something much older and darker than simple schoolyard bullying." Mr. Harrison pulled a leather-bound album from a mahogany bookshelf, its pages yellowed with age. His hands shook slightly as he placed it on the coffee table between them. "What I'm about to show you," he said, "hasn't been seen by anyone outside the founding families in over 50 years. The album's spine crackled as he opened it, revealing black and white photographs that smelled of dust and secrets. Tommy leaned forward, squinting at the first image, a group of teenagers standing on the steps of what looked like Millbrook High, but somehow different. Younger. The date scrawled in the corner read 1962. "That's me." Mr. Harrison pointed to a thin boy on the edge of the group, partially turned away from the camera. "And that?" His finger moved to the center, indicating a handsome youth surrounded by admirers. "Is Charles Thompson, Jake's grandfather." Tommy's stomach lurched at the connection. "But you look afraid of him." "With good reason." Mr. Harrison turned the page, revealing a series of newspaper clippings. The headlines were mild. "Local youth group maintains community standards," and "Thompson family donation establishes new school wing." But Mr. Harrison's expression suggested darker meanings beneath the words. "Millbrook Heights was founded by 7 families who made their fortune in railroad money," he explained. "The Thompsons, the Petersons, the Whitakers, they created what they called a perfect community. But perfection, they believed, required control." He pulled out a small object from between the pages, a metal pin showing the same crown as symbol Tommy had seen carved into his locker. This was their mark of power. The families used it to identify those who needed to be put in their place. Children of immigrants, anyone who questioned their authority, kids who didn't fit their image of perfection. But that was 60 years ago. Tommy protested. "How could it still be happening?" Mr. Harrison's laugh was bitter. "Power doesn't die easily. The families pass down their traditions, their prejudices. They train their children to maintain the hierarchy. The school board, the police, local businesses, they're all connected to these families somehow." He flipped to another page, showing a class photo from 1975. "Look closely at the back row." Tommy gasped. Standing together were younger versions of his current teachers, Ms. Peterson, Principal Whitaker, even Mr. Roberts the janitor. All wearing small crown eye pins on their collars. "They were recruited young," Mr. Harrison explained. "Chosen to help maintain the system. Your generation isn't the first to suffer, and unless someone breaks the cycle, you won't be the last." A sudden noise from outside made them both jump. Through a gap in the curtains, Tommy saw a police car cruising slowly past the house. Mr. Harrison quickly closed the album. "Officer Mills," he muttered. "Third-generation protector of Millbrook Heights. They watched this house, you know. They've always watched me, ever since I started gathering evidence." "Evidence of what?" "Everything. The pattern of accidents that happen to kids who fight back. The mysterious fires that destroy certain families' businesses. The way some student records disappear completely from school files." He fixed Tommy with an intense stare. Why do you think no one ever investigates the bullying? Why teachers look the other way? The founding families made sure the whole system works in their favor. Tommy thought about how his parents' complaints to the school board had gone nowhere. How Jake Thompson never seemed to get in trouble, no matter what he did. It all started making a horrible kind of sense. What happened to the others? He asked. The kids like me from before? Mr. Harrison's face darkened. Most moved away. Some gave in, learned to keep their heads down. A few. He trailed off, then reached for something else hidden in the album. This was taken 3 months ago. It was a modern photograph, showing a familiar scene, the school parking lot after hours. In it, Jake Thompson and his friends were huddled in a circle, their parents standing behind them. They were passing something between them that glinted in the streetlight. They're giving them the pins, Tommy whispered, feeling sick. Teaching them how to choose their targets. Yes. And now that they've marked you. Mr. Harrison stood abruptly, moving to his window. You need to be careful. More careful than you've ever been. They'll try to provoke you into doing something rash, something they can use against you. That's how they maintain their power, by making their victims seem like the problem. Tommy's mind raced with implications. We have to expose them. If people knew. No! Mr. Harrison's voice cracked like a whip. Not yet. You're not ready. They have contingency plans for people like us, believe me. His expression softened slightly. But you're right, this needs to end. And maybe you're the one who can finally do it. But first, you need to learn everything. About them, about the town's real history, about how they've kept this secret for so long. He pressed the album into Tommy's hands. Take this. Study it. But keep it hidden, if they knew I had these records. He glanced nervously at the window again. Come back tomorrow after school. There's more you need to know, but it's not safe to tell you everything at once. As Tommy slipped out the door, clutching the album under his jacket, Mr. Harrison caught his arm. And Tommy? Remember, they're watching. Always watching. Trust no one else with what I've shown you. Not yet. The school library's basement archive smelled of mildew and forgotten things. Tommy had convinced Mrs. Chin, the librarian, to let him in by claiming he was working on a local history project. She'd hesitated at first, but something in her expression when he mentioned the founding families made him wonder if she knew more than she let on. Armed with his phone's flashlight, Tommy navigated through towers of cardboard boxes and metal filing cabinets. Mr. Harrison's album had mentioned a fire in 1973 that destroyed many town records, but according to the old man, copies had survived here, hidden away by a librarian who'd suspected something wasn't right. A rat skittered across his path, making him jump. The beam of his flashlight caught something reflecting in the corner, an old trophy case, its glass clouded with dust. Tommy wiped a small section clean and froze. There, in a teen photo from 1970, he saw another crown eye pin, this time on the coach's lapel. Looking for something specific? Tommy spun around, heart hammering. Mrs. Chin stood in the doorway, her silhouette backlit by the stairwell light. But instead of anger at finding him snooping, her face showed something else, concern, and maybe fear. I know what you've been marked with, she said softly, closing the door behind her. My brother wore the same mark in '89 before. She swallowed hard. Before we had to leave town. Tommy's mind raced. You came back? Someone had to. She moved to a filing cabinet, unlocking it with a key she wore around her neck. Someone had to keep the records to remember. She pulled out a thick folder. Like this. Every accident that happened to marked kids, every family that mysteriously lost their business or moved away suddenly. I've been tracking the pattern for years. The folder contained newspaper clippings, incident reports, and photographs. Decades of systematic intimidation hidden in plain sight. Why hasn't anyone stopped them? Mrs. Chen's laugh was hollow. Money. Influence. Fear. Pick one. She pointed to a recent clipping. See this shop that burned down last month? The owner's daughter had just started asking questions about the school board's funding. A sound from upstairs made them both tense. Mrs. Chen quickly returned the folder to its cabinet. "You should go." "But Tommy..." She pressed a small key into his hand. "Cabinet 22B. Come back when it's safer. There's more." That evening, Tommy couldn't focus on his homework. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed down on him like a physical thing. He spread out the contents of Mr. Harrison's album on his bedroom floor, cross-referencing names and dates with online searches. His computer screen showed dozens of open tabs, old yearbook photos, property records, newspaper archives. Patterns emerged: families that had lived in Millbrook Heights for generations, always in positions of influence. Others that appeared briefly in records before vanishing completely. A soft knock at his window nearly made him scream. Jake Thompson's younger sister Sarah crouched on the roof outside, her face pale in the moonlight. Tommy hesitated, remembering Mr. Harrison's warning about trusting no one. But something in her expression made him unlock the window. "They're planning something," she whispered, slipping inside. "For tomorrow. I heard them talking, Dad, Jake, and the others. They're worried because you've been asking questions, been seen with old Harrison." Her hands twisted together nervously. "They're going to plant something in your locker, get you expelled." Tommy studied her face, looking for signs of deception. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah pulled up her sleeve, revealing a familiar mark carved into her skin. "Because I'm chosen to be next year's enforcer, to replace Jake when he graduates. They..." Her voice cracked. "They make us prove ourselves by hurting others. I can't. I don't want to be part of it anymore." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a USB drive. "I copied files from Dad's computer. Records of meetings, lists of marked kids going back decades, financial transactions. Everything they've tried to hide." Tommy took the drive with trembling hands. "They'll know it was you." "No, they won't. Dad thinks he accidentally deleted everything during a system update." "But Tommy..." Her eyes filled with tears. "Be careful how you use it. These people, my family, they'll do anything to keep their power. Anything." After Sarah left, Tommy sat in the dark, turning the USB drive over in his hands. Between this, Mrs. Chen's records, and Mr. Harrison's album, he finally had real evidence. But Sarah's warning echoed in his mind, mixing with Mr. Harrison's cautions about moving too quickly. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. 22B, midnight. Bring what you found. Time to connect all the pieces." The signature made his blood run cold, a simple ASCII art drawing of a crowned eye. The school corridors felt different at midnight, like a living thing holding its breath. Tommy's flashlight beam caught the gleam of trophy cases and classroom windows, each reflection seeming to hide watching eyes. The USB drive in his pocket felt as heavy as the dread in his stomach. His footsteps echoed off the lockers, each sound making him wince despite knowing the security cameras had been disabled. Another gift from Sarah's apparent betrayal. The library basement's lock clicked open with Mrs. Chen's key, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Cabinet 22B stood open, mocking his caution. Inside lay a single piece of expensive stationery, the kind his mother used for special occasions. The message was written in flowing script. 1879 Founders Lane, the truth waits where it all began. Below it, a final warning. Come alone, or others will suffer. Tommy recognized the address instantly, the old Thompson mansion. It had stood abandoned for nearly 30 years, ever since the family built their new estate across town. Local kids told stories about it being haunted, but the real ghosts, Tommy now realized, were the secrets it held. The mansion's grounds stretched out before him, moonlight painting the overgrown Victorian gardens in shades of silver and shadow. As he approached the front door, motion-activated lights suddenly flooded the garden with harsh brightness. Tommy froze, blinking against the glare, as a figure emerged from behind a weathered marble statue, Principal Whitaker. "I was beginning to worry you wouldn't come," she said, her voice carrying that same condescending tone she used during school assemblies. "Though I suppose curiosity is a powerful motivator." Other shapes moved in his peripheral vision, familiar faces stepping out of the darkness. Mr. Roberts, the janitor. Coach Phillips, the owner of the local pharmacy. Parents he recognized from PTA meetings. All wearing those crown-eye pins that seemed to catch and hold the light. "Where's Mr. Harrison?" Tommy demanded, fighting to keep his voice steady even as his heart threatened to burst from his chest. "Patience," a new voice answered, smooth as expensive whiskey. Richard Thompson, Jake's father and head of the school board, stepped forward. Other members of the founding families emerged behind him. The Petersons, the Whitakers, faces Tommy had seen in Mr. Harrison's photographs now made flesh. "All your questions will be answered soon enough." They led him through the mansion's grand entrance, past rooms where furniture lurked under white sheets like sleeping giants. The air smelled of dust and decay and something else, power. Old power. The kind that had seeped into the very walls of this place. The ballroom must have been magnificent once, with its soaring ceiling and wall-length mirrors now clouded with age. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, their light reflecting off the pins of the gathered elite. And there, in the center of it all, sat Mr. Harrison, bound to a chair. But something was wrong. The old man's posture was too straight, his expression too calm. As Tommy watched, Mr. Harrison smiled, not the gentle smile of their earlier conversations, but something predatory, and the ropes fell away as if they'd never been tied at all. "Perfect timing," Mr. Harrison said, standing with none of his previous frailty. From his pocket, he withdrew something that made Tommy shocked, a crown-eye pin, newer and brighter than the others. "No." Tommy's voice came out as a whisper. "This can't be." "But it is." Mr. Harrison's voice had transformed, losing its warmth and vulnerability. "Did you really think someone who's lived in this town for 6 decades would turn against their own? Against generations of tradition and purpose?" He gestured to the assembled crowd. "Everything I showed you, every story, every secret, it was all a test. One you've passed with flying colors." Eleanor Thompson, Jake's mother and head of the local historical society, stepped forward. Her heels clicked against the marble floor like a countdown. "We've watched you carefully, Tommy. Your resilience in the face of the marking. Your intelligence in piecing together our history. Most of our chosen targets break quickly, they run away, submit, or lose themselves in helpless rage. But you..." Her smile was proud, almost maternal. "You kept digging. Kept fighting. That's exactly what we need. New blood. Fresh perspectives to help maintain order in a changing world. By terrorizing innocent kids?" Tommy's voice cracked with betrayal and anger. "By destroying families who don't fit your perfect mold? By maintaining necessary hierarchies?" Principal Whitaker corrected, her tone the same one she used to explain detention policies. "Every successful society needs structure. Leaders and followers. Those who guide and those who learn their place. We simply make those lines clear early, teach valuable lessons about power and its proper use." Tommy's hand clenched around the USB drive. "And what if I expose you all right now? I have everything, Sarah's files, Mrs. Chen's records." Laughter echoed through the ballroom, bouncing off the mirrors until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Sarah?" Jake Thompson materialized from the shadows, his sister beside him. Both wore matching expressions of amused contempt. "Did you really think the next in line to lead would betray her birthright? The drive is blank. Just another layer of the test." But in their moment of triumph, Tommy noticed something crucial. None of them were watching Mrs. Chen's key, still clutched in his left hand. The key to records they didn't know existed, documentation even their influence couldn't touch. Real evidence, waiting in the True Cabinet 22B, the one in the public library's basement archive room. "So," Mr. Harrison stepped forward, the crowned-eye pin extended like a scepter. "Will you join us, Tommy? Help guide the next generation of Millbrook Heights? Or..." His eyes hardened to chips of blue ice. "Choose a path that might prove rather unfortunate for you and those you care about." Tommy stared at the pin, trying to imagine himself wearing it. Using it. becoming part of this system that had caused so much pain, all in the name of order and tradition. He thought about every kid who'd ever been marked, every family driven away. He thought about the weight of generations of cruelty masked as civic duty. And in that moment, he made his choice, one that would change everything. Tommy's fingers closed around the pin, feeling its cold metal edges bite into his palm. The crown eye seemed to stare back at him, challenging him. In that moment, time seemed to slow as memories flashed through his mind, every taunt, every bruise, every kid who'd disappeared from school without warning. With a sudden surge of defiance, he hurled the pin across the ballroom. It struck one of the clouded mirrors with a sharp ping, leaving a crack that splintered outward like a spider's web. "No," he said, his voice carrying a strength that surprised even him. "I choose truth. And I'm not alone." Before anyone could move, he pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. "This entire conversation, your confessions, your threats, your whole twisted tradition, has been broadcasting live for the past 20 minutes. He turned to Mr. Harrison, whose face had lost its smug certainty. "And not just to social media. Mrs. Chen helped me set up simultaneous streams to every news outlet in the state." "Impossible," Principal Whitaker snapped, but her hand trembled as she reached for her phone. "We monitored all communications." "You monitored what you knew to look for." Tommy cut her off. "But did you check the new Wi-Fi network installed last week? The one disguised as a system update?" He smiled grimly. "Turns out the IT company that handles school maintenance has a grudge against you. Something about their owner's daughter being marked back in '95. The assembled elite pulled out their devices, faces draining of color as notifications flooded their screens. The live stream was exploding, with local news stations already picking up the feed. Hashtags were trending, hashtag Millbrook Secrets, hashtag Crown Eye Cult, hashtag Justice for the Marked. Tommy wasn't finished. From his jacket, he withdrew what looked like a standard student ID card. "Mrs. Chen didn't just keep paper records," he said, holding it up. "This card contains a micro drive with 3 decades of security footage. Every accident you arranged, every secret meeting, every time you forced teachers to change grades or destroy complaints. All backed up to servers across the country." Sarah Thompson's practiced smirk faltered. "You're lying. We swept everything. Every computer, every file. But did you check behind the false wall in the library basement? The one installed by Mrs. Chan's brother before you drove him out?" Tommy watched realization dawn on their faces. "There's a reason the basement blueprint shows 2-room 22 BS. The real one's been gathering evidence since before I was born." Richard Thompson lunged forward, his aristocratic composure shattering, but stopped short as camera flashes erupted outside the mansion's windows. Red and blue lights bathed the ornate facade as police vehicles, not just local ones, but state police and special units, surrounded the building. The whump-whump of helicopter rotors joined the growing chaos. "You arrogant child," Principal Whitaker hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I learned from the best," Tommy replied, his voice steady. "About power. About planning. About making sure your enemies underestimate you." He addressed the whole group. "While you were busy testing me, I was building an army. Every kid you marked in the past 5 years. Every family whose business mysteriously failed. Every teacher forced to look the other way. They're all outside, ready to testify." Mr. Harrison's face contorted with generations of entitled rage. "This system has existed longer than you've been alive. We built this town. We own. Not anymore." A new voice rang through the ballroom, sharp as a whip crack. Agent Diana Chin strode in, her special badge gleaming. Behind her, federal agents moved to secure the exits. "Hello, Uncle Harrison. Surprised to see me? You should have checked what happened to that little girl you drove out of town 20 years ago. Some of us don't stay broken." Tommy watched comprehension dawn on their faces. "Did you really think Mrs. Chin came back just to be a librarian? She's been coordinating with federal investigators for years, waiting for someone on the inside to help expose everything. All she needed was someone you'd underestimate. Someone you'd try to recruit. As handcuffs clicked shut and Miranda rights were read, Tommy caught sight of Jake Thompson trying to slip away through a servant's entrance. Running away, Jake? Like all those kids you terrorized? Jake spun around, his face a mask of desperate fury. You don't understand. This was our heritage, our birthright. We protected the natural order. No, Tommy said quietly. You protected your own power. But that ends tonight. Through the mansion's windows, camera flashes strobed like lightning. On the front lawn, Mrs. Chen coordinated with a growing crowd of reporters while Agent Chen supervised the arrests. The crown eye pins lay scattered across the ballroom floor like fallen stars, their power broken. In the first light of dawn, Tommy stepped out to face the waiting cameras, no longer a victim but a victor. He'd proven that sometimes the greatest power lies not in maintaining control, but in having the courage to shatter it completely. Behind him, the cracked mirror caught the rising sun, its spiderweb of fractures transforming the crowned eye's reflection into something new, a symbol not of oppression, but of liberation. 1 year later, Millbrook Heights High School buzzed with a different kind of energy. Where silence and fear once ruled the hallways, laughter and genuine conversation now echoed off the lockers. The newly elected student council, led by an unlikely alliance of former marked kids and reformed bullies, had transformed the school's culture. Tommy stood before his open locker, now decorated with pictures of the student advocacy group he'd founded. Breaking the cycle. The crown eye symbol that once terrorized students had been reclaimed and redesigned. Now it was cracked down the middle, with a dove emerging from the break. Ready for the ceremony? Lucy Chen, Mrs. Chen's niece and the student council vice president, approached with a stack of programs. Everyone's gathering in the auditorium. Today marked the official dedication of the Millbrook Heights Recovery and Reconciliation Center, housed in the renovated Thompson Mansion. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The former seat of power had become a place of healing. As Tommy helped Lucy distribute programs, he spotted Sarah Thompson helping younger students hang artwork in the hallway. After testifying against her family, she'd chosen to stay with her aunt in town, determined to be part of the change. The other Thompson children had made similar choices, breaking free from generations of toxic legacy. Did you see the morning news? Lucy asked, showing Tommy her phone. The headline read, Former Millbrook Heights Marked One's Launch National Anti-Bullying Initiative. The article featured interviews with students from across decades, sharing their stories of survival and transformation. In the auditorium, Tommy scanned the crowd. Agent Chen sat beside her aunt, Mrs. Chen, who had been appointed as the school's new principal after the dust settled. Former victims sat alongside reformed enforcers, their shared commitment to change stronger than their past divisions. Even some of the former elite families had chosen redemption over exile. The Petersons had donated their considerable resources to establishing scholarship funds for bullying victims. The Whitakers turned their business expertise to helping families who had been previously driven out of town rebuild their livelihoods. Tommy stepped up to the podium, the weight of the past year evident in his more confident posture. A year ago, he began. I stood in this same spot, terrified to speak up. Today, I see a community that's learned the hardest but most important lesson, that true strength isn't about power over others, but about lifting each other up. He gestured to the wall behind him, where photographs told the story of Millbrook Heights' transformation. Images of the federal investigation played alongside pictures of community healing sessions, new friendships forged across old boundaries, and the gradual dismantling of generational hatred. The Crown Eye no longer watches us with judgment, Tommy continued. Instead, we watch out for each other. Every student who walks through these doors now knows they're safe, valued, and heard. In the audience, Jake Thompson shifted in his seat. After a year of mandatory counseling and community service, he'd become one of the program's strongest advocates, using his former influence to help other bullies understand the impact of their actions. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new mural, painted collaboratively by students, parents, and community members. It showed a diverse group of hands breaking chains, with the words, "Never Again," written in multiple languages. As people mingled afterward, Tommy felt a tap on his shoulder. An unfamiliar elderly woman stood there, tears in her eyes. "I was marked in 1965, she said softly. "I left town and never looked back, until today. Thank you for giving us back our home." Later that evening, Tommy visited the library basement one last time. Cabinet 22B had been converted into a time capsule, preserving evidence of both the darkness and the light. Future generations would learn not just about the abuse of power, but about the courage it takes to stand against it. Mrs. Chen found him there, looking at the old photographs. "You know," she said, "when my brother and I started collecting evidence, we hoped someone would eventually use it to make a difference. But you did more than expose the truth, you showed everyone how to heal from it." Tommy smiled, touching the scar where his own crown eye mark had been. It had faded significantly, but he chose not to hide it. It was part of his story, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal when brought into the light. Outside, the setting sun painted Millbrook Heights in golden hues. Children played freely in yards where fear once kept them indoors. Former victims walked with straight backs and raised heads. And in windows across town, small stained glass symbols caught the light, broken crowned eyes with doves soaring free, reminding everyone that the darkest of legacies could be transformed into beacons of hope. The cycle was broken, and a new one had begun, one built on courage, truth, and the unshakable belief that change was always possible, one heart at a time.